Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
We live in a culture that highly esteems reason and logic. We want to be able to calculate things carefully. We look up to people who argue deductively and have a good logical sense about them. Rationality is an important value in our culture. And I think very often it is to the detriment of the imaginative life, of fantasy, and of daydreaming.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Ken Phillips, a teaching assistant in the art department at Bowling Green State University. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of imagination and the value of daydreaming. Here's Father Bacik.
Ken, I would like to talk a little bit about imagination, and since you have one of the wildest fantasy lives of anybody that I know, I thought it would be good to invite you to discuss that a little bit with me. Are you game for that?
I think I'm up for it, Jim, and I just really am grateful for this opportunity to come to your Baroque studio and sharing this event with you.
Well, good. So let us get on with it then. We'll talk a little bit about imagination and daydreaming and fantasy life. Actually, I think fantasy life is not highly esteemed in our culture. I think teachers are in the habit when students are off daydreaming, they tell them, well, that's no good. Stop that daydreaming. I think perhaps we live in a culture that highly esteems reason and logic. We want to be able to calculate things carefully. We look up to people who argue deductively and have a good logical sense about them. Rationality is an important value in our culture. And I think very often it is to the detriment of the imaginative life, of fantasy, and of daydreaming. And I think very often when this is the case that perhaps we somehow are limited as human beings. I'm recalling a line of Chesterton that said something about when we are into rationalism, it means we've lost everything except our minds. We've lost all of the other sides of life, which we usually associate with this idea of imagination. I guess our imagination is our ability to project ourselves elsewhere, to put ourselves into the past, to reconstruct our past in a different kind of way, to think of the future, to think, to move ahead into what is possible in life, and to make combinations in the present moment, to put things together. So when I'm talking about imagination, without going into a big theory of it, it simply means, I think, our common sense notion of our ability to project and to get out of the ordinary and to think about the future, to imagine alternatives and so on. I'm wondering, since you are such a creative person, how that got developed in you. Does this analysis ring any bells with you? Did people tell you as you were growing up, don't be so creative or get rid of that fantasy life and so on?
Well, Doctor, it's like this. When I was 6, no, I grew up pretty much on an alone basis, and I feel like this is going to be the explosion of my personal life. But since
I'm not looking for a whole history. I just want a little bit of comment on whether you indeed were inhibited like that as you were growing up.
I think there was a certain element of that. But fortunately, along the way, having a natural bent towards, I suppose, the arts in general, poetry, music, visual arts, and drama and whatnot, I've had teachers along the way who really encouraged that. I suppose the role of the teacher, in your point, was really well put, because a teacher or a parent or an older sibling and that sort of thing can kind of, influential persons can encourage that whole quality of being imaginative and be able to draw up images out of past and future and what is and what could be. And they can encourage that, or it can be squelched, as you indicated already.
Mm-hmm. I guess, and that does happen for many people. I think as they go through their schooling experience, maybe they were very excited, and we see little kids who got great imaginations and love to play and can reconstruct things and imagine the future and all, and somehow, as they go along in school, that seems to get set aside, and people become more inhibited and sort of unable to express themselves. I think one of the problems that comes along with that is the whole idea of depression. I've noticed that in counseling people very often who are depressed, that one of their problems is that they cannot imagine any kind of better future. They feel themselves locked into the situation right now. So I talked to a graduate student who is just totally immersed in work and feels all kind of drains upon their time and activity, and they sort of feel like, well, life will always be like this. It won't end. I can't imagine any way of managing the next 6 months or year because I'm imprisoned in this situation. I see that with married couples, too, that are having a lot of troubles. One of the things is to try to get them to feel as though it could be different somehow, and yet they often feel imprisoned. Well, we're not communicating, we're not getting along, she always yells, he never understands, and their image is that it will always remain like this. I think that without our imaginations, we really are prey to this kind of depression in many ways. We have this tendency, perhaps, to somehow focus in on the bad side of what is going on. I'm thinking, too, of the analysis of the brainwashing that went on in during the Korean War, what the Chinese did to the prisoners. They separated them out, isolated them, and one of their techniques was to get these people to focus on the bad parts of their life. In other words, they forced their imagination into a narrow track, perhaps looking at 10% of what was wrong with them. And in this, we know they broke many of those men, and in fact, some of them simply laid down and died. And I think it's possible, for even in more ordinary circumstances, for people to brainwash themselves, to keep their imagination just zeroed in on what is bad in their life. So someone goes to bed at night and says, boy, everything went wrong today. All they can think of in their mind is the dumb things they said and the hurts that were inflicted on them by other people and all the ways they didn't respond properly to the challenges of life. It's possible not only on a daily basis, but over a period of time to think that way, to begin to think, I'm a bad person, to have sort of a poor self-image, precisely because I'm saying here our imagination is narrowed in some way, focused in on just one part of who we really are.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm thinking about a number of people that I talked with where the situation was where the imaginative possibility of what could happen to my life at key moments was squelched down by influential people, the important people or the authoritative person. And to have that imaginative moment kind of crushed, enough of those experiences kind of deadens the whole imaginative possibility.
I remember experiences you're talking in my own life. Like I remember one of my teachers in the seminary asked me a question, and I couldn't come up with the usual memorized answer, as I always tried to do. And so he looked at it, I couldn't answer, so he says, well, why don't you think this out? Think it through. I thought, well, that's a novel idea. So here I am, I try to think. So I really tried. I tried to think of an answer, and I came up with an answer, and I gave it to him, and he says, well, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And I think that my thinking process was sort of put on hold there for a while.
But you've recovered just
marvelously. Well, sometimes. I think that this is what a teacher can do, or a parent, by squelching this effort to move out of the ordinary ways of doing things, which I think our imaginative faculty, again, or ability, if you want to use that word, is got to do with breaking out of the ordinary, with envisioning possibilities of functioning in a different way. It does a lot more than that, but that seems to me one of the important things that imagination can do for us.
It seems to me now also the whole possibility of people influencing us or influencing the creative imaginative potential, that just the opposite can happen, where seemingly a person or an experience would crush the imaginative facility, but actually after a while it tends to nurture it. For instance, isolation, which in some situations might destroy a person, actually ends up increasing the whole imaginative ability.
I was just thinking, as you said that, this idea of sensory deprivation, I think when they put people in those situations, they hallucinate a lot. Their imagination does get unleashed in some ways. I suppose that some of the creative people in our world, or famous people, have actually reacted against a rather strict upbringing or a rigid approach to life or some sort of perhaps authoritative control in their life and felt the need to think more creatively and to look at a situation different. I think of Kierkegaard in the 19th century, who sort of rebelled against a rigid Christianity as he saw it and became very imaginative in his ways of understanding our relationship with God. And I'm sure we could think of many artistic people throughout history like that. Well, so we have before us, Ken, somewhat of the problem then, huh? Living in a rationalistic culture where logic and science is highly prized, and daydreaming or fantasy life and the work of the imagination is not so highly prized. And I guess we're trying to see that could hurt us personally. Individuals could feel sort of constrained or rigid or end up very often, I think, being depressed. That might be one of the results of a constrained imagination, that we indeed feel as though there's no alternatives for us in life, and then what are we going to do about this? Now, I think we ought to turn our attention now to trying to get some sort of positive response to this and to see how we can put imagination into a proper setting. I think, first of all, we have to remember that as human beings, the ability to imagine is part of what it means to be human. We humans are people who are in process, that we have a future ahead of us. We're trying to create our essence. We're trying to make ourselves to be what we will be forever. I like that notion of who we are. We are the question for whom there is no answer. We're the ones who are searching for our identity. And what that does, of course, is sort of open up a future to us. It says, I don't have to be imprisoned in my past. I don't always have to have this fault. I could get over it. I don't have to live with this crummy situation. There might be a way in which I can indeed improve it. So I like that idea of saying that we are the creatures who are really oriented to the future in one way or another. And we're really constructed in our imagination. That's an essential part of who we are, so that naturally when we deny that, we're going to be less than human somehow. It would suggest on the positive side, I suppose, a creative effort to improve ourselves. Now, I think much more could be said about this business of who we are and how we can understand ourselves. We could think of ourselves as the dreamers, just to use other language here. We're those who can dream of a better future. We think of the power of the dream in life. There's a Marxist philosopher by the name of Ernst Bloch, who is 20th century thinker, now deceased, but Bloch said that Freud analyzed night dreams, and that was really good, and we learned a lot from night dreams, and I know you, for one, pay a lot of attention to your night dreams and find out about their symbolism and so on. We can learn a lot about ourselves, but Bloch suggested we can learn even more about ourselves by examining our daydreams, because our daydreams aren't censored. They're very straightforward. You don't need an analyst to tell you really what they mean. And our daydreams reveal again our possibilities, our alternatives. And he's big on saying, let's foster daydreams. Instead of telling the children not to daydream, let's see if we can't do it in some sort of a constructive way here. Because the daydreams enable us somehow to get beyond the imprisoned situation that we feel.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The whole idea of being able to, in a sense, create your own scenario for your own future. I'm thinking about maybe the present climate today, where it seems there's a certain resignation, like everyone else is in charge of my future, the government, various social agencies, and all that sort of thing. And I think we let go of the idea that really there's a great deal of power, imaginative power, for me to create my own future, and it gets buffeted around by various real limits. But, for instance, as an artist or as a poet, I have a certain imaginative scope that tells me that there are a lot of possibilities for my life. And I'm thinking about various other people that to me wouldn't be really high on the creative level or the imaginative level because it's been beaten down, or that whole element of playfulness, perhaps, I think that's another good corollary word, that seems to be processed out of people, that there's no time or room to be playful, to act out or to dance out the whole idea of a dream, that this could be. And so I buy into someone else's perhaps gloomier scenario for my life rather than creating my own.
I was thinking the average kind of person who isn't particularly creative or artistic still needs to hear this kind of thing, don't they? I think of what's that little book they have, What Color is Your Parachute, or something like that? I can't remember the exact title, but I know the approach is to get people to think about their talents and what they can accomplish in life and sort of tailor their work to that. Mm-hmm. I think if students who are trying to figure out what to do with their life, that's one approach. Instead of saying, well, there's all these slots, I got to fill one, maybe there's something more that can be done with one's life, or maybe there's a job that you hadn't thought of that you could get into that really fits your talent. So, I mean, in many ways, it seems like we could really help ourselves by trying to imagine better futures. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, too, so we have a general understanding, then, that we humans are those people who can daydream, and we can dream of a better future. That's what characterizes us, and when we don't use that, we're really in trouble in some ways or another. I think that therapies often try to help people in this way. I think of Rollo May, the psychotherapist, who says that when he's dealing with depressed people, one of the first things he tries to do is to get them to imagine alternatives. To start to think concretely, how could it be different? How do I want it to be different? Sometimes when people are depressed, they can't even do that. You just sort of wallow in self-pity or spiral downward, and you can't really imagine that. And with the help of another person, you can sometimes begin to think, well, it could be different. I'll do that in marriage counseling and just ask people, well, how would you like it to be? You know, if this relationship was much better, what would it be like? How would you interact? How would you communicate? What would you tell one another? Sometimes just to get people started thinking in that way is a real help. Sometimes just to give people very definite things to do, meditation techniques, for example, positive imaginings, and so on. I think that just the fact that you can say, hey, I can take charge of my life, as you were saying, I think very well, we can get beaten down and think that we're just at the mercy of the fates or the bureaucracy that's around, so we can't do anything about it. But what we've got to feel is that we can take charge, make something of our lives, and that there are alternatives. Sadly, I mean, we got to be realistic about this. Some people have trouble finding alternatives. They're imprisoned in situations where it's hard to imagine how you're going to get out of it. I've talked to people like that. We think of people living in the ghettos very often. What realistic options do they have? What viable alternatives? And yet somehow I want to keep a hopeful note in there and keep imagination alive. You know, keep going with this idea that even in the worst of situations, maybe we're able to imagine different responses to it, so on. So I think we can deal a lot with depression by just imagining like this. I was thinking, too, I'm back to the brainwashing thing, what I was talking about, the Korean experience and so on, and in the fact that we can brainwash ourselves. There's an author, William Lynch, he's written a famous book called Images of Hope, in which he describes his therapy in there, and he says the problem in life isn't that we imagine too much or have too much rich a fantasy life, but that it's not enough, that imagination is too truncated or limited. That's the real problem. And if you look at the brainwashing experience, you can see this. If you're just focusing in on 10% that's bad in your life, and your whole mind's always revolving around that, and that's what's in your consciousness all the time, of course you're going to feel bad, and of course you're going to be non-productive. The real therapy there is to activate the other 90% of your imagination so that you spend time thinking about those good things, and imagine your talents, and imagine what you could contribute to the world. So here we find an interesting imaginative type therapy as well, in which I try to think about the pluses that are in my life as well as the negatives. So the person going to bed at night who's really having a tough time, I will suggest to them that they go through their day in terms of reconstructing it all according to a positive light. Put a thread through it that sees all the good things that you did, and rather than letting the line run through all of the negativities that you've experienced through the day. And I think we could do this. Positive imaginings, go back over the times we succeeded in life before we've got a tough new assignment, a new job, a new challenge in a day or something. Go back to a time when we handled it well and just put ourselves into that scene. Let our imaginations take us back there and feel what it was like.
As I listen to you, I'm thinking about problem solving, and as a teacher, especially a teacher of art, I come in contact with a lot of students who, to me, more and more as time goes on, seem to indicate that the whole imaginative linkage, the whole possibility that there could be a number of possibilities of answers or solutions to this problem. So I give students visual problems, and a number of them freeze up and think, well, there's got to be one solution to this, and it's got to. You used the idea of a slot earlier. There has to be one thing that this, set of restrictions, that is basically any problem that's been given. There's only one answer to all that, and many students freeze up because they think, oh, well, I can't possibly figure out, what keys it takes to get things into that slot. And I think if people begin to realize that there are a number of possibilities to situations that we're encountering, that there isn't just one, and one doesn't have to work forever and whatnot. So I think it's good to pull that constantly into our consciousness, and I think it's kind of a battle. It's a conscious battle. I consider, this is my soapbox, TV to be a great deadener. I see that in students over the last number of years. It seems, not always, but the numbers of students that look for entertainment and whatnot constantly from the boob tube seem to be lacking the possibility of figuring things out for themselves. And I know that's a broad generalization, but I found it borne up more often than torn down.
You will be vastly criticized by the people who are in favor of TV and so on. But radio, on the other hand, is a very imaginative medium.
Radio is wonderful. For instance, if people could only see the studio that we're in, the tapestries hanging and the gold candelabra, and I thought the champagne was a really nice touch here today, Jim, and just very, very thoughtful.
I was right at the beginning of this program. You have a wild imagination. And it leads me to the next point I wanted to make, which is that imagination can somehow be excessive at times. You can get carried away. Now, while we're really going big on the value of imagination, let's face it, there's a way in which, like everything else human, it could go to excesses. It needs somehow, I think, to be principled or tempered. Now, let's think, for example, of a man who's struggling to be faithful to his wife and is finding that he has the roving eye and so on. Now, this man is probably going to have to try to keep his fantasy life in some sort of check. He can't just let his imagination roam if he expects to remain faithful in this relationship. So I think we could probably think of a lot of ways in which it could really mess us up. I think of the nostalgia thing today. A lot of people use their imaginations to take themselves back into a previous time somehow, and maybe spend too much time reminiscing about the past instead of trying to construct the future. And so I think that we would probably want to keep the sense that imagination has to be principled, that somehow it has to be ruled, that imagination at its best gets us in touch with reality and helps us to live in a better fashion. I'm thinking of that movie that Pennies from Heaven right now, Pennies from Heaven, where the guy, his fantasy life takes him away from real relationships. He can't relate well to his wife, for example, because his fantasy life is so rich. He's off someplace else. He's not dealing with reality. And so that highlights, I think, this kind of problem, that it indeed can be excessive. So while we are celebrating imagination, I think, in general in our conversation, I think there is an ambiguity about it that has to be respected in some ways.
Yeah, it comes up very practically, for instance, again, in the arts, where a poet or a musician or a visual artist may have a tremendously imaginative concept, but unless it's really kind of guided and coaxed into a certain sense of balance or rightness, it comes off being wonderfully creative, perhaps, but lacking a certain substance, a solidity that the form, the principles that you're talking about might bring in.
But to return to I think our dominant theme, which is that we can use some developing of our imagination. I think that educators probably could do a better job of promoting creativity among students, that parents probably could deal with their youngsters in a way that would help them to develop their imaginations. We could use daydreaming for a good purpose. Our own daydreams could tell us, well, what am I really interested in? What am I about in life? What do I want to make of myself? Which people am I really interested in? What are my problem areas in life? In other words, I think we could use daydreams as a way of interpreting our own lives. We could do a much better job of knowing who we are if we know this imaginative side. Sometimes we don't know what our interests are. We don't know what's bugging us. We don't know what our angers are. If we let our fantasy life go, we might find out that we're angry at somebody without really ever having recognized it. We might find out we have an interest or talent that we never tapped before. And so I think that it would be well for us to pay attention to that fantasy life. We could try to cultivate it in some ways, I suppose, by reading more poetry. I wrote an article not long ago suggesting that priests who do preaching could well develop their fantasy life by reading more poetry. And maybe that would improve their preaching in some way, help them to be more imaginative, to use better kind of imagery in their sermons.
I'm thinking, too, of the inside idea that our imagination offers. Ever since I was, for instance, in high school, I'd always had these tremendous dreams about expanding the art department of whatever building I was attached to, and it would become excessively large. But it was a marvelous kind of fantasy, and I find that in every place that I'm in, I always want to develop that idea. And those building ideas, those developing ideas, expansive ideas, indicate a lot to me about my own nature as a person, that I like to build things, I like to develop things and see things really kind of creatively expand and mushroom all over the place. So that's one of the things in my own particular
that you would learn about yourself from your fantasies. Yeah, that's good. I think that I relate a lot of this to religious notions, too. It's interesting that Marxist philosopher I was telling you about looks at Jesus in a very positive light. Even though he's atheistic in his own orientation, he sees Jesus positively because he understands that Jesus was an imaginative kind of person, that Jesus talked about the new age, the coming of the kingdom. Jesus talked a lot about possibilities in life. And I find this sort of an exciting idea. What it suggests to me is that there are resources in our Christian tradition which would enhance imagination, which would remind us of the importance of imagery in our lives. That right in our biblical tradition there is this whole idea of expanding our notion of what is possible. All things are possible with God in this picture. Jesus leads us into a new life, a richer and deeper life. And so I think we could bring that in and say that all this talk of imagination we've been doing really fits into a Christian framework. We've been saying that imagination is a problem in terms of depression and feeling truncated in one way or another and limited in our lives. And so I think it is a very religious notion to say we're going to stir up our imaginations, get our creative powers going so that we can work for the Lord in this way, so we can follow the example of Jesus, who talked about a new and better kind of kingdom where we were supposed to find our fulfillment one day. And so imagination, Ken, is the key word here. And daydreaming is not a bad word, but it's something that we could foster. We could learn a lot about ourselves and about our possibilities and all the kinds of things that we might accomplish in life, using our gifts and talents to help create some kind of a better world.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Ken Phillips, a teaching assistant in the art department at Bowling Green State University. The topic of this week's Reflections was imagination and the value of daydreaming. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.